But, said Ariel, still are there many things that remain dark to me. Indeed, I would fain know who be these Valar. Are they the gods? So be they, said Lindo, though concerning them men tell many strange and garbled tales that are far from the truth, and many strange names they call them that ye will not hear here. But Vaire said, Nay then, Lindo, be not drawn into more tale-telling tonight, for the hour of rest is at hand, and for all his eagerness our guest is way-worn. Send now for the candles of sleep, and more tales to his head's filling and his heart satisfying the wanderer shall have on the morrow. But to Ariel she said, Think not that you must leave our house tomorrow of need, for none do so, nay, all may remain, while a tale remains to tell which they desire to hear. Then said Ariel that all desire of faring abroad had left his heart, and that to be a guest there a while seemed to him fairest of all things. Thereupon came in those that bore the candles of sleep, and each of that company took one, and two of the folk of the house bade Ariel follow them. One of these was the door ward, who had opened to his knocking before. He was old in appearance and grey of locks, and few of that folk were so. But the other had a weather-worn face, and blue eyes of great merriment, and was very slender and small, nor might one say if he were 50 or 10,000. Thus it was that the Ainulindale was first to be heard by mortal ears, as Ariel sat in a sunlit garden in Tolleresi. So this is from the Lost Tales, and this is part 1. And I found the part where it talks about how the elves told about Ainulindale, that the creation myth and how Arda began. And so this is really in kind of the notes of Tolkien, but he doesn't include it in his actual stories. But we do get it in the Lost Tales that Christopher Tolkien was able to put together. And so he goes on and tells him about the Valar. And here it is. Even after Ariel had fallen away, Rumil remained, the great Noldiran sage of Tirion, who first achieved fitting signs for the recording of speech and song. The music of the Ainur continued to be ascribed to him, though infested with the gravity of a remote time he moved far away from the glorious and whimsical philologists of Cor Tirion. It is to be noted that in this account, Rumil had been a slave under Melko. Here the exile of the Noldor from Valinor appears, for it is to this that Rumil's words about the march from Coro undoubtedly refer, rather than in Inway's march into the world, and something is said also of the languages and those who spoke them. Then said Rumil, Hear now things that have not been heard among men, and the elves speak seldom of them. Yet did Manwe Sulimo, lord of the elves and men, whisper them to the fathers of my father in the deeps of time. Behold, Iluvatar dwelt alone. Before all things he sang into being the Ainur first, and greatest is their power and glory of all his creatures, within the world and without. Thereafter he fashioned them dwellings in the void, and dwelt among them, teaching them all manner of things, and the greatest of these was music. Now he would speak, propounding to them themes of song and joyous hymn, revealing many of the great and wonderful things that he devised ever in his mind and heart. and now they would make music unto him, and the voices of their instruments raise in splendor about his throne. So that is from the Lost Tales, and this is the actual Silmarillion, the tale that Romil and Ariel actually spoke when they would talk about the creation myth of the elves and where they came from to the other elves. Because men, as he said, seldom got to hear that tale. Ainulindale, the music of the Ainur. There was Eru the one who in Arda is called a Luvatar, and he made first the Ainur, the holy ones, that were the offspring of his thought, and they were with him before aught else was made. And he spoke to them, propounding to them themes of music, and they sang before him, and he was glad. But for a long while they sang only each alone, or but few together, while the rest hearkened, for each comprehended only that part of the mind of Iluvatar from which he came, and in the understanding of their brethren they grew but slowly. Yet ever as they listened, they came to deep understanding and increased in unison and harmony. So at this very beginning, we see a lone consciousness, one mind that starts to begin to think things outside of itself. And by doing that, it split its psyche into different parts that represented different aspects of the consciousness. And so the Ainur are thought forms, they are called the holy ones. What I find very interesting in this very beginning part is that there is no discord. There's no Melkor Ainur, in the idea that Melkor is included in the Ainurs, and he is one of the Ainurs that is already speaking, singing in harmony with the others. And here is a very important part where it says this: yet ever as they listened, they came to deeper understanding and increased in unison and harmony. So for a while, each Ainur, because they came from the specific mind of Eru, and they represented that within their vibrations and the thought forms that they represented, and they were alone, but slowly they started to realize that they could join with others. And although they had different parts that they represented, they were still connected. And so they were creating the unison and the harmony sounds. And it came to pass that the Iluvatar called together all the Ainur and declared to them a mighty theme, unfolding to them things greater and more wonderful than he had yet revealed, and the glory of its beginning and the splendor of its end amazed the Ainur, so that they bowed before Iluvatar and were silent. Then Iluvatar said to them, of the theme that I have declared to you, I will now that ye make in harmony together a great music. And since I have kindled you with the flame imperishable, ye shall show forth your powers in adorning this theme, each with his own thoughts and devices, if he will. But I will sit and hearken, and be glad that through you great beauty has been wakened into song. So we are still seeing the harmony here. The great music, the theme is being created within Eru's mind, and the Ainur are showing that they are now being infused with the flame imperishable, eternal consciousness that never dies. The flame imperishable, that spark of consciousness and awareness. And so he's saying, I'm going to sit back. I'm going to let you sing, and I want to hear this great music before me. And then this is what happens. Then the voices of the Ainur, like unto harps and lutes and pipes and trumpets and viols and organs, and like unto countless choirs, singing with words, began to fashion the theme of Iluvatar to a great music, and a sound arose of endless interchanging melodies, woven in harmony that passed beyond hearing into the depths and into the heights. And the places of the dwelling of Iluvatar were filled to overflowing, and the music and the echo of the music went out into the void, and it was not void. Never since have the Ainur made any music like to this music. Now that part can be a little bit confusing in the idea of what is the void. Well, I found an interesting idea of the void based on quantum psychology, which is basically what I talk about on my channel and what I believe Tolkien is hinting at. Psychology that is related to the way that the quantum world works and how the universe came to be and how each of us came to be and our consciousness came to life. So here is an idea of the void that I could find that could describe what Tolkien was thinking about within his mind in the closest way. It's called the Nameless Absolute. Here it is. There is no birth, there is no death, there is no person. It is all a concept. It is all an illusion. The above was the most important statement that Nazagarhati Maharaj ever made to me. To appreciate its depth, we will first explore the nameless absolute, beyond the void. First, I would like to discuss how the nameless absolute began to appear to me. In 1977, I had the opportunity to go with Swami Muktandu to Shridi, the site of the shrine of Shridi Sa Baba, who died in 1918. While I meditated each day, quite unexpectedly, I began to feel as though I was being sucked into a spiraling vortex. I was left both breathless and beyond. I neither knew what it was, nor was there anyone to guide me, since at this time in history, gurus did not offer such individualized guidance. It freaked me out, and I gave the ring as a gift to Swami Muktandu, but the memory of those experiences haunted me for 12 years. Then in 1990, this experience began to be repeated. It would suddenly reappear for hours at a time and then disappear. No words can even begin to describe what happened, because in this state, even the void itself seemed inconsequential. What I realized was that there is not one void, but an infinite number of void universes. Buddhism states that emptiness is form and form is emptiness, which is true within one void universe. To go beyond that, you have to go beyond the infinite number of void universes. In Buddhism, the void universes are the Buddha fields, or you can say each void universe is a Buddha. Each identity has its own void universe. Every experience has a void that is floating in. In quantum physics, the void universes can be likened to parallel universes. You could call the nameless absolute the supreme witness, or the Buddha fields, because the voids reside within the nameless absolute. Soon the voids disappear like burning oil wells that are contained within the desert. The space between the void universes is the nameless absolute. And the void universe, which was interesting here, is the space where you have no concept of time, of self identity. It is nothingness. It is a place of no identity with anything else except for the darkness around you. It is completely about a sleep state of consciousness. So that is the void in that terms before consciousness arise. But this is where it gets interesting, is that he says this: and the places of the dwelling of Iluvatar were filled to overflowing, and the music and the echo of the music went out into the void, and it was not void. Never since have the Ainur made any music like to this music, though it had been said that a greater still shall be made before Iluvatar by the choirs of the Ainur and the children of Iluvatar after the end of days. Then the themes of Iluvatar shall be played aright, and take being in the moment of their utterance, for all shall then understand fully his intent in their part, and each shall know the comprehension of each, and Iluvatar shall give to their thoughts the secret fire, being well pleased. So the void, it is a place of no identity. It is a place of darkness that exists as almost a potential energy field to create whatever within that space. So the music from the mind of Eru that started to fragment itself into different parts and create the harmonious music of those different parts that symbolize a unison, but different parts assigned to them. Those music, that sound actually went out into the void, the place of non-self identity, the place of a field of consciousness where nothing existed yet. And the music pierced that void, and it was no longer a void any longer, because the music gave the identity and gave the theme and started to give the actual identity of the universe to the universe. And that's what the void is. It became no longer a void, but it had an identity. Just as science is starting to think about the idea that the universe is a sentient, aware source, that there is a sentience behind the universe. So this is following that idea that with the music, it awakened the state within the void of non-self into the place of duality and into the place of self-identity. So it's no longer a void. So we'll keep on going here. But now Iluvatar sat and hearkened, and for a great while it seemed good to him, for in the music there were no flaws. But as the theme progressed, it came into the heart of Melkor to interweave matters of his own imagining that were not in accord with the theme of Iluvatar, for he sought therein to increase the power and glory of the part assigned to himself. Tolkien is referring to the birth of the ego, because if the Eru Iluvatar is the super consciousness, Melkor is the ego, the part of ourself that wants to assign a larger part to ourself within a collective and feel our different identities and things like that. And the ego is not all bad at all, but there's an imbalance of the ego that can cause arrogance, can cause tyranny, and trying to dictate and control others. And so this is the birth of the ego. Melkor symbolizes the actual birth of the ego. But remember, it all comes from Eru. So it's Eru's ego. So think about that when it comes to your own mind. And as we go through Ainulindale, the idea of you as a consciousness and how your thoughts fragment themselves and they get represented into the world in different ways. And your ego plays the antagonist. It plays the part that seeks to separate things and keep it from the unity, consciousness, and feeling interconnected with everything. So a lot of New Age spirituality and all of those ideas from the old times is about when someone reaches ego death, in the idea of being able to penetrate through the ego, then they are one with all things. They are Eru again, no longer Melkor, Eru, and all the Ainur fighting against Melkor. So Melkor symbolizes the birth of the ego. And I have some interesting things on the ego with Carl Jung, and we'll get to that soon. So the music was fine, but Melkor got it in his mind to increase his own part, to make it louder, to make it however he wanted it to sound. To Melkor, among the Ainur, had been given the greatest gifts of power and knowledge, and he had a share in all the gifts of his brethren. He had gone often alone into the void places, seeking the imperishable flame. For desire grew hot within him to bring into being things of his own. So Melkor, the Ainur, went into the void, into that state of no sense of identity, a dark space with nothing yet constructed. And Melkor saw that space as a potential to create his own creations within that void. He was getting impatient. Eru had not created the universe yet. He had not created Arda yet within that void. The music has not quite solidified. It was sound waves. It was waves, frequencies, and vibrations, but it was not yet solid matter that could materialize before the Ainur's eyes. Melkor became impatient, and he sought for the way to create. He was looking for the imperishable flame, the eternal consciousness, and that spark that could give life to creation. The reason why Melkor could not get to it, could not see it, was becoming frustrated, was because it lied in the mind of Eru. And Eru symbolizes oneness. And Melkor simply was not there because he represented the ego. So we had that part that separated itself from the oneness, and it actually represented the duality in the universe. So the duality, the ego, was born with Melkor. And because Melkor symbolizes the ego, when the ego becomes imbalanced, it can become impatient. It could want to create things that are not in alignment with the whole collective. So he was going into the void area and looking and seeing. It says here, sorry, my voice here. He had gone often alone into the void places, seeking the imperishable flame, for desire grew hot within him to bring into being things of his own. And it seemed to him that Iluvatar took no thought for the void, and he was impatient of its emptiness. Yet he found not the fire, for it is with Iluvatar. Because Iluvatar, Eru Iluvatar, symbolizes the oneness factor. And at this point in time, Melkor was not symbolizing oneness. He was starting to symbolize difference, diversity, duality, antagonistic intentions. to go against the flow, to walk away from the group, to be that rebel. Yet he found not the fire, the eternal consciousness, for it was with Iluvatar. But being alone, he had begun to conceive thoughts of his own, unlike those of his brethren, because his brethren, the other Ainur, were harmonious. They were harmony makers. They were in alignment and in agreement with Eru's theme. And so they were creating music that was harmonious, in flow of Eru. And the ego split itself and started to cause the conflict. Some of these thoughts he now wove into his music, and straightway discord arose about him, and many that sang nigh him grew despondent, and their thought was disturbed, and their music faltered. Tolkien wrote that because it's very important to understand that Melkor was one with them still. So as one of their brethren started to create discord, it affected the whole group of the Ainur. They stopped to singing in the way that they were before, just to listen to him, to say, what is Melkor doing? What is this sound? What are these strange discord, sounds, and what is this happening? And the Ainur, they ended up saying to themselves that they were going to hearken and basically stop what they were doing, and it caused them to lose focus of their own role because Melkor was increasing his part so much. And here it says, and their thought was disturbed, and their music faltered. But some began to attune their music to his, rather than to the thought which they had at first. Then the discord of Melkor spread ever wider, and the melodies which had been heard before foundered in a sea of turbulent sound. But Iluvatar sat and hearkened until it seemed that about his throne there was a raging storm, as of dark waters that made war one upon another in an endless wrath that would not be assuaged. So now Melkor is making the discord sounds. The other Ainur, some of them are starting to follow his sounds because they are trying to create the harmony. So they're kind of trying to follow Melkor, but there is no way to follow discord. Discord, by the very definition, is if you take many different sounds that don't normally go together and you make a bunch of noise. So the Ainur were trying to sing in harmony with it, but they couldn't. And so Iluvatar sat back and he was watching what was going on. He was listening to what was happening. Remember, it's coming from his mind as well. Then Iluvatar arose, and the Ainur perceived that he smiled, because he doesn't have a face. It's just consciousness. So the Ainur could only perceive that he smiled. They could feel it within them being part of his mind. And he lifted up his left hand, and a new theme began, and amid the storm, like and yet unlike to the former theme. And it gathered power and had new beauty. But the discord of Melkor rose in uproar and contended with it. And again there was a war of sound more violent than before, until many of the Ainur were dismayed and sang no longer, and Melkor had the mastery. This can be likened to when you yourself know that there's a quiet, still voice within you that can be happy, that can feel one with everything, can enjoy your life. But then there's another voice within you that fights against that wants to claim your self-identity as a broken being that had a terrible life, and you claim that identity, And that ego identity starts to shape who you are. And so that still, quiet voice, the real eternal consciousness that you each are, becomes quiet, and the ego becomes louder. The self-identity of your life experiences become louder in that moment. And this is when we forget who we really are deep inside. Not the ego. The ego shapes and forms through our life experiences and through our different unique essence and what role we want to play on earth and how we want to experience ourselves. But it is not truly who we are. Who truly we are has no self-identity. I mean, when we really get down to it, and those of us that have done some deep meditation and have really gotten to that place of void, of what the Buddhas call the emptiness fields or Buddha fields, you are one with everything and yet nothing. You are not yourself. You're not what you went through and endured in your life. You're not your achievements and your accomplishments. You're not your successes. You're not anything of that. You are simply eternal consciousness itself. And that voice gets drowned out by the ego. And this is the deeper spiritual messages that Tolkien was referring to, is what Melkor represents. So let's keep on going and see what happens and how we get through this. So Melkor had the mastery. All of a sudden, no more harmony was in that moment. It was just Melkor making a bunch of noise. It's your ego talking over your full self and saying you are this, you're that, you're this, labeling you in negative and also positive ways. And there was no other music at this moment. But then again, Iluvatar arose, and the Ainur perceived that his countenance was stern, and he lifted up his right hand, and behold, a third theme grew amid the confusion, and it was unlike the others. For it seemed at first soft and sweet, a mere rippling of gentle sounds in delicate melodies, but it could not be quenched, and it took to itself power and profundity. And it seemed at last that there were two musics progressing at one time before the seat of Iluvatar, and they were utterly at variance. Variance is complete difference. So Melkor had his music going, I could just bang on anything around the room right now and make what Melkor probably made. It is sounds that don't normally go together. It is chords that crash and sound just terrible to the ears, that discord, nails on the chalkboard, things that don't normally go together the way that the chords are supposed to. And yet, Eru still had a sweet sounding melody that continued strongly, continued throughout, very sweet sounding, very gentle, and then it increased. It increased because to me that represents a individual like Frodo, taking on the ring himself. Sweet, gentle melody of courage, of friendship, and just struggling through. And then what happened? It increased in power and profundity. So then it started to sound really powerful, because then you get the wizards involved, then you get the elves involved, then you get mankind involved, all against this dark army. So we can look at the music in that way, in terms of what we could see a situation on Earth play out. So that's how I see it. And this is interesting because at that same time that music was playing, Melkor was playing his noises and discord sounds. The one was deep and wide and beautiful, but slow and blended with an immeasurable sorrow, from which its beauty chiefly came. And the other had now achieved a unity of its own, but it was loud and it was vain. So then eventually Melkor's sounds came together, and then they started to actually come in union. So it was no longer discord, but it was loud and vain and arrogant sounds. Tyranny, wanting to be ruler over others, wanting to overpower and dominate. These are the types of thoughts that Melkor had, and that created the particular vibrations and the frequencies and the sound waves that created that sound of arrogance, of vanity. And yet Eru, even though he was the central consciousness, his sound was of basically of this beauty that was so deep and wide, life itself growing and struggling through even the discord that was being created. So you can start to see the fight between good and evil start to appear. You can actually see these thoughts come forward, the duality in the universe, the dark and the light, and the fights and the peace and the compromise. This is where we start to see it, is this music being created and endlessly repeated. So it was loud, it was vain, and it was endlessly repeated. We have evil to battle all the time because it never stops, it never ceases, it never wants to take a look at itself and realize the deeper voice within that wishes to seek for peace and harmony with all others within a collective. The ego does not want to do that. Not until you awaken your higher consciousness, the higher self, and you understand what the ego is, and then the ego and the higher self can be partners. We'll talk on that later. So here it is, but it was loud and vain and endlessly repeated, and it had little harmony, but rather a clamorous unison as of many trumpets braying upon a few notes. Oh my gosh, I can imagine just trumpets like and I also hear like, I don't know, like the disc coming together and just making all these sounds, a very sensitive sound. So I could only imagine this noise. And it essayed to drown the other music by the violence of its voice. But it seemed that its most triumphant notes were taken by the other and woven into its own solemn pattern. So this is really neat here. And it essayed to drown the other music by the violence of its voice. But it seemed that its most triumphant notes were taken by the other and woven into its own solemn pattern. Now, here's where we start to see the sadness of Melkor, that discord, violence, going against the collective, creating a bomb to kill many people within a collective. When people go against the grain of society in terms of hurting others and stepping away from society in a way, but not in a healthy way, but in one that you create anger within you and hate within you of others. And so there's this separation, not this unity consciousness. But there's always something sad within it. If you look at the characters within our human history, if you look at the characters within literature, and you look at Melkor, there's a sadness there because it's not in union with the others. There's an isolation, a self-fulfilling prophecy of being alone and being completely isolated because you're angry and you hate others and you're jealous of others, or whatever emotions that you feel. That's what Melkor was feeling towards the other Valar, and we learn that later on when we get to the actual creation of Arda. So there's this solemn pattern even within the violent sounds. Tolkien was very wise to see that there's sadness within those that strive to create violence, strive to hurt and harm others. There's sadness there. And if we can get at the root of the sadness, we may be able to heal the individual before they create that violence within the collective. In the midst of this strife, whereat the halls of Iluvatar shook, and a tremor ran out into the silences, yet unmoved, Iluvatar arose a third time, and his face was terrible to behold. Then he raised up both hands, and in one chord, deeper than the abyss, higher than the firmament, piercing as the light of the eye of Iluvatar, the music ceased. So now Iluvatar had enough. This is likened to you when you just have your inner voice just stop all the noise. Just stop all the chatter telling you what you are, what you aren't, what you can't do, what you can, what you should do. Just stop. Iluvatar stopped all of that noise because it was within himself as it was. And even though Melkor represents a separation, you can control the ego. You can control that side of you. And all it takes is looking within yourself and realizing your power to do so. And Iluvatar arose, put both his hands up, put together his hands, I guess, and created this chord that could cease all other sounds. And even Melkor couldn't do anything in that moment. Then Iluvatar spoke, and he said, "Mighty are the Ainur, and mightiest among them is Melkor. But that he may know, and all the Ainur, that I am Iluvatar, those things that ye have sung, I will show them forth, that ye may see what ye have done. And though Melkor shalt see that no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite, for he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself hath not imagined." So now we get into some really interesting ideas here. The idea that Iluvatar at this point is recognizing the mightiness of Melkor, understands the strength of the ego, knows that the ego can run your whole life. It can make people be asleep their entire life, in which they lead a life where they're not in touch with the higher self. And very much in the ancient times, this is why we've had so much bloodshed. This is why we've had so much horrible things happen within humanity, crimes against humanity, is because there have been people in this life, in this human history, that have never listened to that higher voice, that higher self, and have only listened to the ego self. So it's very important that we get in touch with the higher self within this new age so that we can create harmonious collectives together and a new earth that's more peaceful and harmonious, where we don't have to suffer through some of the nasty events of the old age, and we have learned from them so that we can move forwards. And this is where Iluvatar speaks the final truth. The truth that many secret societies know, Tolkien knows at this point when he wrote this, that even though there is discord, even though there is somebody who is acting out in ego, even in our history, our human history of violence and terrible crimes against humanity, it is always working towards unfolding a greater theme, a theme about self-realization, in fighting against those that strive to create war and violence, and not fighting as violence against violence, but in other ways, showing peacefulness and showing a type of realization that love and friendship is really the answer. And so anything that Melkor does at this point in time, Iluvatar is saying that you are serving me, even in your destruction, your discord, whatever's going to happen in this universe that is being created, you are serving me. You are ultimately serving the unfolding of reality and showing at the end of all that the actual self, the higher self, can erase all of that, eliminate all of that duality in the world and the discord. And that is the truth that Iluvatar is speaking about here. And if you think about it within your own mind, you can say that completely to your ego. The idea that your ego is what serves ultimately your higher self in terms of understanding itself, of realizing what you are, what you're not, and what you are becoming. And this is something that you're awakening to. And so at this point, he is saying that whatever music that you put out, you are going to be servicing me. And there is a phrase that a lot of the secret societies use, the idea that the darkness is in service to the light, that always the darkness, the dark things, the dark whatever, dark magic, whatever you want to call it, in terms of darker energy, it's always in service to eventual illumination of the true self, the awakening of the true self, the awakening of the true theme of Eru Iluvatar, which is more majestic and beautiful than Melkor can even imagine, because he does not come from the state of wholeness, of oneness. He comes from the state of separation. Then the Ainur were afraid, and they did not yet comprehend the words that were said to them, and Melkor was filled with shame, of which came secret anger. But Iluvatar arose in splendor, and he went forth from the fair regions that he had made for the Ainur, and the Ainur followed him. So now Melkor is put to shame. He was silenced, and he was given a truth that everything you do from this point forward, you are working in service to myself. You are working to fulfill a theme, a grand theme that is playing out. And so he was silent, and Iluvatar then beckoned the Ainur to show them the far regions, the void, where this is where their music started to manifest the physical reality. We'll get more into that here. But when they were come into the void, Iluvatar said to them, "Behold your music." And he showed to them a vision, giving to them sight where before was only hearing, and they saw a new world made visible before them. So think about the Ainur. They're not normal creatures or angels that we would think of them, but they had no eyes before. They simply had ears and a voice, and they could create the sounds that Iluvatar wanted in his great theme of music, but they had no eyes, not yet. Only when Iluvatar said, "Look," that's when they had eyes to see. Everything stems from Eru's mind. I want to apply this to your own life. This world, this reality before you, is very much a void space, a field of space, of consciousness that arranges itself according to the way that you think about the world, or what you want to see, what you want to experience, your thoughts, your desires, your whatever it is that is inside of your mind, your dreams, your hopes, your fears, it all comes out before you for you to see. You are in charge of creating your own reality in terms of the molecules and atoms actually arranging themselves before you. And each of us experience something different, and this is why we have such different opinions and such different experiences. But yet we live in the same world. So we are connected. We are connected by the quantum field of consciousness, but we will experience the world differently, each of us, depending on what is inside of our mind. Bad things can happen to you, but it is the way that you respond. It is the way that you struggle through. Do you remain a good person while you've had that bad experience? Or do you start to slip into the dark paths with your anger, with your hate, with all your sadness and all that you need to heal? That's why healing is so important, because healing the mind will keep you in a reality that is beautiful to you. That is what you desire to see. You have the power of the Ainur. You are Eru, you are Ainur. We are all of it. And so Eru is showing what the thought forms have created and manifested in the void, that field of nothingness, but now there is something. And that's how your life is. That's how all our lives are. Behold your music. This is your minstrelsy, and each of you shall find contained therein, amid the design that I set before you, and all those things which it may seem that he himself devised or added, and thou, Melkor, wilt discover all the secret thoughts of thy mind, and wilt perceive that they are but a part of the whole, and tributary to its glory. And many other things Iluvatar spoke to the Ainur at this time. And because of their memory of his words, and the knowledge that each has of the music that he had made himself, the Ainur know much of what was, and is to come. And few things are unseen by them, yet some things there are that they cannot see, neither alone nor taking counsel together. For to none but himself has Iluvatar revealed all that he has in store. And in every age there came forth things that are new and have no foretelling, for they do not proceed from the past. And so it was that, as this vision of the world was played before them, and Ainur saw that it contained things which they had not thought. So if we go back to this, because this is an interesting part here, the idea that Iluvatar reveals to them, this is what you have created. And although the Ainur are part of his mind, they understand the theme that is starting to grow. They start to see the duality of the universe, and that there's going to be discord and there's going to be harmony within this universe. They are starting to understand Eru in terms of each of them working towards a theme. But yet there are some things that only Eru knows. Now, I think that that's part of the beautiful fantasy that Tolkien wrote about. But for us, please know that unless you have a split psyche into different aspects of yourself, if you remain whole and grounded, You will not have another part of yourself kind of unknowledgeable about your true self, in the idea that that could be what schizophrenics might experience. And those that have multiple personalities, they experience the split psyche where it doesn't quite understand its true self, its true core, and that it represents a total split in the consciousness where you have different characters and you think that that's your self-identity. And that is the journey of the schizophrenic, and that's the journey of the multiple personality. But with you, if you do not have that, then you can see yourself as having wholeness within you, that there is no part within your mind that is not working with you or does not understand your true desires and what you really want to do in life and things like that. So that was a beautiful fantasy part of Tolkien, talking about how there was a part of the Ainur that did not know. And I think that that's where we can see the difference within reality and within the fantasy that Tolkien created here, this fairy tale that is simply beautiful. And it has a lot of relation to our own lives. And in every age there come forth things that are new and have no foretelling, for they do not proceed from the past. This is extremely interesting. The idea that history cannot repeat itself. Every universe that is born, every Big Bang consciousness split into many different aspects of itself in a sentient universe, will always be a new timeline. You can never exactly create the same thing. And that's kind of what I was talking about with my life is sacred, in the idea of fighting against our suicidal attempts and thoughts, which I have gone through before. And what I have realized is that when you view life as sacred, in the idea that you can never come back to the exact same state of being, that consciousness is ever evolving and ever moving and ever changing. And so nothing is static, and the idea that you won't have the same energy flow, you won't have the same combinations of frequencies that will materialize the reality around you. And so every single life is sacred in the idea that it's different, it's unique, and there's nothing else that comes again like it, but it could be similar, but it won't be exactly the same. And so he's saying that this is the universe that is a new universe, and it has no foretelling to what happens in the future in terms of there's no set destiny in terms of how the universe goes, and it does not proceed from the past. There is a completely different timeline in this theme of the universe. And so it was that as this vision of the world was played before them, the Ainur saw that it contained things which they had not thought. And they saw with amazement the coming of the children of Iluvatar and the habitation that was prepared for them. And they perceived that they themselves, in the labor of their music, had been busy with the preparation of this dwelling. So now they're starting to see Arda, which is earth, being formed. And they're starting to see the coming of beings on this planet. And they are now starting to get busy with their own preparation for this dwelling of these beings and where they were going to live, and yet knew not that it had any purpose beyond its own beauty. So they didn't see a purpose to Arda. They didn't see a purpose to Earth. They saw that it was just beautiful, that, you know, that life was going to spring forward on it, and it was just beautiful to see, especially if it came from a dark void where there was nothing else there. And so they saw it with beauty in mind, but they didn't understand the purpose behind it. For the children of Iluvatar were conceived by him alone, and they came with the third theme, and were not in the theme which Iluvatar propounded at the beginning, and none of the Ainur had part in their making. So now it gets interesting, because now we see that the children of Iluvatar were in only Eru's mind, and the Ainur did not understand that part of his mind, and they were not part in that making yet. Therefore, when they beheld them, the children of Iluvatar, which were the elves and men and all the other beings, the more did they love them, being things other than themselves, strange and free, wherein they saw the mind of Iluvatar reflected anew, and learned yet a little more of his wisdom, which otherwise had been hidden even from the Ainur. So now they're seeing the elves, the first children of Iluvatar, and they're saying, wow, they're beautiful beings. This is a beautiful planet. We don't know what the purpose is, but we love them. We love seeing them. Remember, this is coming from the mind of Eru, but is also a part that lies deep within Eru to understand what the purpose of life is. Now the children of Iluvatar are elves and men, the firstborn and the followers, and amid all the splendors of the world, its vast halls and spaces, and its wheeling fires, Iluvatar chose a place for their habitation in the deeps of time, and in the midst of the innumerable stars. So now we have the place where the planet Arda will lie amongst the innumerable stars. And yet there are maybe some stars that have not been created yet, because we know that Varda becomes the one that creates the stars. Although there was some indication that there were some older stars that were already there, part of the universe of Ea, which is what the universe is called. But the deeps of time, time-space, space-time, the idea of the fields of time within our universe. This is where Earth lies. And this habitation might seem a little thing to those who consider only the majesty of the Ainur and not their terrible sharpness, as who should take the whole field of Arda for the foundation of a pillar, and so raise it until the cone of its summit were more bitter than a needle, or who consider only the immeasurable vastness of the world, which still the Ainur are shaping, and not the minute procession to which they shape all things therein. So by this time, when the elves are speaking amongst themselves about this mythology, there is still indication that the Ainur are still creating the world, is still creating, like nothing is fixed in the way of, there's no set planet and life, that things are still being created within the mind of Eru, within the music of the universe and the Ainur. And yes. And this habitation might seem a little thing to those who consider only the majesty of the Ainur and not their terrible sharpness, so their intelligence. Like, if you just take them for being noble and beautiful and these amazing, energies, but not the intelligence behind each of them, as who should take the whole field of Arda, that Arda itself is an intelligent, sentient, aware place that's constantly changing and evolving, for the foundation of a pillar, and so raise it until the cone of its summit were more bitter than a needle, or who consider only the immeasurable vastness of the world, which still the Ainur are shaping, and not the minute precision to which they shape all things therein. But when the Ainur had beheld his habitation in a vision, and had seen the children of Iluvatar arise therein, then many of the most mighty among them bent all their thought and their desire toward that place. So now the Ainur, they're seeing this habitation, and their desire, their focus, all of it is going towards that planet, towards Earth or towards Arda. And of these, Melkor was the chief, even as he was in the beginning the greatest of the Ainur, who took part in the music, and he feigned even to himself at first that he desired to go thither and order all things for the good of the children of Iluvatar, controlling the turmoils of the heat and the cold that had come to pass through him. But he desired rather to subdue to his will both elves and men, envying the gifts with which Iluvatar promised to endow them, and he wished himself to have subjects and servants, and to be called Lord, and to be a master over other wills. Right there. If anybody ever says that the Valar are lords and the idea that they lord over others, that is what Melkor sought for. The other Valar did not want to lord over the beings. They wanted to help shape the world and help to keep order of certain dominions and aspects of their powers that they represented, but they did not want to rule over others. Only Melkor did. But the other Ainur looked upon this habitation set within the vast spaces of the world, which the elves called Arda. The earth and their hearts rejoiced in light, and their eyes, beholding many colors, were filled with gladness. But because of the roaring of the sea, they felt a great unquiet, and they observed the winds and the air, and the matters of which Arda was made, of iron and stone, and silver and gold, and many substances that we are all made of. All the elements, we literally are just stardust and earth elements. That's what makes us. And so they're starting to see all these elements come forward of what's going to create the planet here. And they are seeing all the colors, the greens and the blues and the browns and all parts of the land, because there's no life yet in terms of the animals or the beings like the elves yet, but in their mind they understand that that's coming. So what's happening now is that the colors are filling their hearts with gladness, and they're starting to see the elements come forward, the winds, the air, the matter of which Arda was made, the iron and stone and silver and gold and many substances. But of all of these, water they most greatly praised. And it is said by the Eldar that in water there lives yet the echo of the music of the Ainur, more than in any substance else that is in this earth. And many of the children of Iluvatar hearken, still unsated, to the voices of the sea, and yet know not for what they listen. Now to water had that Ainu, whom the elves called Ulumo, turned his thought, and of all most deeply was he instructed by Iluvatar in music, but of the airs and winds Manwe most had propounded. Who is the noblest of the Ainur? Of the fabric of earth had Aule thought, to whom Iluvatar had given skill and knowledge scarce less than to Melkor. But the delight and pride of Aule is in the deed of making, and in the thing made, and neither in possession nor in his own mastery, wherefore he gives and hoards not, and is free from care, passing ever on to some new work. And when Iluvatar spoke to Ulmo and said, See thou not how here in this little realm in the deeps of time, Melkor hath made war upon thy province? He hath bethought him of bitter cold, immoderate, and yet hath not destroyed the beauty of thy fountains, nor of thy clear pools. Behold the snow and the cunning work of frost. Melkor hath devised heats and fire without restraint, and hath not dried up thy desire, nor utterly quelled the music of the sea. Behold rather the height and glory of the clouds, and the ever-changing mists, and listen to the fall of rain upon the earth. And in these clouds thou art drawn nearer to Manwe, thy friend, whom thou lovest. Then Umul answered, Truly, water is become now fairer than my heart imagined. Neither had my secret thought conceived the snowflake, nor in all my music was contained the falling of the rain. I will seek Manwe, that he and I may make melodies forever to thy delight. And Manwe and Ulmo had from the beginning been allied in all things that have served most faithfully the purpose of Iluvatar. But even as Ulmo spoke, and while the Ainur were yet gazing upon the vision, it was taken away and hidden from their sight. And it seemed to them that in that moment they perceived a new thing, darkness, which they had not known before except in thought. But they had become enamored of the beauty of the vision, and engrossed in the unfolding of the world, which came there to being, and for their minds were filled with it, for the history was incomplete, and the circles of time not full wrought, when the vision was taken away. And some have said that the vision ceased ere the fulfillment of the dominion of men, and the fading of the firstborn. Wherefore, though the music is over all, the Valar had not seen, as with sight, the later ages, or the ending of the world. Then there was unrest among the Ainur, but Iluvatar called to them and said, I know the desire of your minds, that what ye have seen should verily be, not only in your thought, but even as ye yourselves are, and yet other. Therefore I say, Ea, let these things be, and I will send forth into the void and flame imperishable, and it shall be at the heart of the world, and the world shall be, and those of you that will may go down into it. And suddenly the Ainur saw far off light, as it was a cloud with a living heart of flame. And they knew that this was no vision only, but that Iluvatar had made a new thing, Ea, the world that is. Thus it came to pass that of the Ainur, some abode still with Iluvatar beyond the confines of the world, but others, and among them many of the greatest and most fair, took the leave of Iluvatar and descended into it. But this condition Iluvatar made, or it is the necessity of their love, that their power should thenceforward be contained and bounded in the world to be within it forever until it is complete, so that they are its life and it's theirs, and therefore they are named the Valar, the powers of the world. So there were many, many Ainur, but only 14 decided to experience the world. And when we think about the idea of coming down into the physical world, it's very much like the idea of the Gardens of Eden, where Adam and Eve were said to be in that fairy tale. And that is a message about the idea of when the consciousness is lowered, a more physical reality takes place. When the consciousness is higher, in the higher states, then only a quantum field of reality takes place. Light bodies, that's what that experience is. That's what the Ainur were. That's what Iluvatar is. It is non-material types of realms of existence when you're in that higher consciousness. But because the idea that the Ainur represent, it's not like that story in the Bible, in the idea of lowering the consciousness to experience Earth. It is the idea of lowering vibrations and becoming more physical as they can become, because the Valar, even though they take different forms, they are they are changeable. They're not necessarily fully solid unless they want to be, and they can take different kinds of clothing and costume, and they can look different depending on how they choose. So they have more of this ability and this power as the Valar. But when the Valar entered into Ea, they were at first astounded and at loss, for it was as if naught was yet made which they had seen in vision, and all was but on point to begin, and yet unshaped, and it was dark. So when they entered finally into Arda, or into the universe Ea, and then Arda, they realized that it wasn't all formed yet, that they only saw the vision that Eru gave them, that what was coming to be. But the Ainur that became the Valar, the 14 Valar, they saw that there was not yet that vision that came into manifestation. It was unshaped, and the world was dark, for the great music had been but the growth and flowering of thought in the timeless halls, and the vision only a foreshowing. But now they had entered in at the beginning of time, and the Valar perceived that the world had been but foreshadowed and foresung, and they must achieve it. So Eru gave the vision of what the universe was to look like, and the Ainur are experiencing the making of it, the beginning of it, that it's all up to them now, that they are the ones to put forth the physical manifestation of the vision of Eru. So began their great labors in wastes unmeasured and unexplored, and in ages uncounted and forgotten, until in the deeps of time and in the midst of the vast halls of Ea, there came to be that hour and that place where was made the habitation of the children of Iluvatar, and in this work the chief part was taken by Manwe and Aule and Ulmo, but Melkor too was there from the first, and he meddled in all that was done, turning it, if he might, to his own desires and purposes, and he kindled great fires. Because now we don't just have the harmonious Ainur, we have that one Valar, we have that one Ainur that came also into Ea, that represents the separation, the conflict, the violence, the darkness, all of that. And so they realize that he's with them. When therefore earth was yet young and full of flame, Melkor coveted it. And he said to the other Valar, "This shall be my own kingdom, and I name it unto myself." But Manwe was the brother of Melkor, in the mind of Eru Iluvatar, and he was the chief instrument of the second theme that Iluvatar had raised up against the discord of Melkor, and he called unto himself many spirits, both greater and less, and they came down into the fields of Arda and aided Manwe, lest Melkor should hinder the fulfillment of their labor forever, and earth should wither ere it flowered. And Manwe said unto Melkor, "This kingdom thou shalt not take for thy own, wrongfully, for many others have labored here no less than thou." So he's saying that you can't take this as your kingdom, that look at all these other Valar, we have put our effort, and we have worked no more than you have. Because once again, Melkor symbolizes the arrogance, the wanting to increase your part, that kind of thing. So he says, you can't take this. And there was strife between Melkor and the other Valar from this point on. And for that time, Melkor withdrew and departed to other regions and did there what he would. But he did not put the desire of the kingdom of Arda from his heart. Now the Valar took to themselves shape and hue, and because they were drawn into the world by love of the children of Iluvatar, for whom they hoped, they took shape after that manner which they had beheld in the vision of Iluvatar, save only in majesty and splendor. So now they're starting to take their shape and their colors and whatever they look like. And they are doing it out of love for the children of Iluvatar, the elves, as the first, and the men who are coming. Moreover, their shape comes of their knowledge of the visible world, rather than the world itself. So they are not shaping themselves based on the world in terms of what the world looks like. They are shaping themselves on their knowledge about what they are to act like and what they are to bring forward as the great theme that Eru created. So they each take that shape of what the vision spoke to them and showed them what they were each supposed to represent. A storyboard is being created. Characters are being created. Eru he's created this storyline that is taking place right now. And the Valar are starting to become a little bit solid so that they can experience the physical world. And they needed not, save only as we use raiment, and yet we may be naked and suffer no loss of our being. So sometimes the Valar just walked completely naked because it wasn't the same for us that wants to clothe ourselves. Therefore, the Valar may walk, if they will, unclad, and then even the Eldar cannot clearly perceive them, though they be present. So the elves cannot even see the Valar sometimes, that only if the Valar want to be seen, which has happened a few times in history, Ulmo became seen. But there is a very slight chance of actually seeing the Valar, that they are still this unseen energies, very, very high vibration. So they did not lower their vibration to become completely physical like us humans in actual reality of the quantum world. It is about them staying at their high vibration and just representing that kind of light body image on a physical earth. But when they desire to clothe themselves, then the Valar take upon them forms, some as of male and some as of female, for that difference of temper they had even from their beginning, as it is but bodied forth in the choice of each, not made by the choice. So what Tolkien is suggesting, and this has nothing to do with those that may identify with something else besides being just male or female. But Tolkien is talking about the idea that there are vibrations, there are actual energetic imprints of feminine and masculine. And that combination of all feminine or all masculine created the Valar, depending on the 7 feminine Valar and the 7 masculine Valar in terms of energy and vibration. What we have today and what we are learning more and more, and I think what the elves symbolize too in many ways, is that those energies of feminine and masculine in terms of the energetic imprints of the vibrations and the frequencies that create that within the collective of understanding what is feminine, what is masculine, they're being blended together in a way. We are at an age and in time where we're starting to see that they all come from the same source, and that each of us as a soul on earth that is a eternal consciousness that can create and design itself before space-time in a way, we can take part in having ourselves have a little bit of feminine or masculine, or having more feminine than masculine, having different amounts of those frequencies. And that will create the physical manifestation of what you appear as or what you take shape as. So the Valar took shape of the music, the actual energetic imprints of divine feminine and divine masculine. And so that's why you have the seven females, 7 males. But when they desire to clothe themselves, the Valar take upon them forms, some as of male and some as of female. For that difference of temper they had even from their beginning, when they were singing and when they were just thought forms. And it is but bodied forth in the choice of each, not made by the choice, even as with us male and female may be shown by the raiment, but it is not made thereby. So you can't necessarily decide if you are going to be female or male with the rational mind, but that your essence has already taken shape with the feminine and masculine energies. And there are souls on earth that have a mix or have different combinations. So that's what we're seeing and we're kind of learning the actual energetic vibrations of masculine and feminine and what that stands for within the collective. But the shapes wherein the great ones array themselves are not at all times like to the shapes of the kings and queens of the children of Ilúvatar, for at times they may clothe themselves in their own thought, made visible in forms of majesty and dread. And the Valar drew unto them many companions, some less and some well nigh as great as themselves, and they labored together in the ordering of the earth and the curbing of its tumults. And this is where the wizards come from, the Ashtaris, and the Maiar. These are the energies that the Valar drew to themselves to have certain companions and helpers in creating this Arda. Then Melkor saw what was done, and that the Valar walked on earth as powers visible, clad in the raiment of the world, and were lovely and glorious to see, and blissful, and that the earth was becoming as a garden for their delight, for its turmoils were subdued. So there was no discord yet. It was absolutely beautiful. This is likened to the Garden of Eden idea, where everything was just absolutely beautiful and there was no conflict and it was just a very, very peaceful state. But Melkor is watching and he is becoming a little bit jealous and, saddened at this and all of those emotions that he represents. And here it is. His envy grew, then the greater within him, and he also took visible form. But because of his mood, because of the energies within his mind, within his thoughts, and the malice, the hate that burned in him, that form was dark and terrible. So he manifested himself to look dark and terrible because of his dark and terrible thoughts about the others. And he descended upon Arda in power and majesty greater than any other of the Valar, as a mountain that wades in the sea and has its head high above the clouds and is clad in ice and crowned with smoke and fire. And the light of the eyes of Melkor was like a flame that withers with heat and pierces with a deadly cold. Thus began the first battle of the Valar with Melkor for the dominion of Arda. And of those tumults the elves knew but little. For what has been declared is come from the Valar themselves, with whom the elves spoke in the land of Valinor, and by whom they were instructed. But little would the Valar ever tell of the wars before the coming of the elves. Yet it is told among the Eldar that the Valar endeavored ever, and in spite of Melkor, to rule the earth and to prepare it for the coming of the firstborn. And they built lands, and Melkor destroyed them. Valleys they delved, and Melkor raised them up. Mountains they carved, and Melkor threw them down. Seas they hollowed, and Melkor spilled them out. And naught might have peace or come to lasting growth. For as surely as the Valar began a labor, so would Melkor undo it or corrupt it. And yet their labor was not all in vain. And though nowhere and in no work was their will and purpose wholly fulfilled, and all things were in hue and shape other than the Valar had at first intended, slowly, none the less, the earth was fashioned and made firm. And thus was the habitation of the children of Iluvatar established at the last in the deeps of time and amidst the innumerable stars. So there we have it. That's the duality of the universe. And you see that everything that they did, Melkor would erase. And that's kind of how our ego works a lot of times. So it can be interesting because if you're not aware of your ego, you can be kind of controlled by that part of yourself. So you have to meditate or get to a place of quiet within yourself so that you can listen to the higher voice that is not going to self-sabotage you. And self-sabotage is something that many of us do. When we think back to our lives and our experiences, we might see, looking back, I did that. I made myself fail, or I ruined that relationship with the way I was acting. There's self-sabotaging your own happiness. There's self-sabotaging. So how do we become aware of that so that we're not self-sabotaging from the place of ego, but we're actually moving from the state of the higher mind of Eru Iluvatar and moving from that place? And I wanted to read to you what Carl Jung said about the ego, and then something a little bit about the energy and how Tolkien was talking about the waves, frequencies, and sounds, the sound waves creating the physical world or the physical universe too. And this is what Carl Jung says about the ego. We can talk about that first. This is actually an essay that he wrote that I found it's called The Ego, Aion. And this is his essay on it. Investigation of the psychology of the unconscious confronted me with facts which required the formulation of new concepts. One of these concepts is the self. The entity so denoted is not meant to take the place of the one that has always been known as the ego, but includes it in a supraordinate concept. We understand the ego as the complex factor to which all conscience contents are related. It forms, as it were, the sentry of the field of consciousness, and in so far as this comprises the empirical personality, the ego is the subject of all personal acts of consciousness. The relation of a psychic content to the ego forms the criterion of its consciousness, for no content can be conscious unless it is represented to a subject. With this definition, we have described and delimited the scope on the subject. Theoretically, no limits can be set to the field of consciousness, since it is capable of indefinite extension. Empirically, however, it always finds its limit when it comes up against the unknown. This consists of everything we do not know, which therefore is not related to the ego as the sentry of the field of consciousness. The unknown falls into two groups of objects: those which are outside and can be experienced by the senses, and those which are inside and are experienced immediately. So the void, the universe, Ea, Arda, all of that is outside and can be experienced by the senses. That's your outside world. Your inside world is where you experience things immediately, and not through the senses of smelling, taste, sight, all that, but through another type of sense, the intuition. The first group comprises the unknown in the outer world. The second, the unknown in the inner world. We call this latter territory the unconscious. So this is the inner world, the unconscious. The ego, as a specific content of consciousness, is not a simple or elementary factor but a complex one, which as such cannot be described exhaustively. Experience shows that it rests on two seemingly different bases, the somatic and the psychic. The somatic basis is inferred by the totality of endosomatic perceptions, which for their part are already of a psychic nature and are associated with the ego, and are therefore conscious. They are produced by endosomatic stimuli, only some of which cross the threshold of consciousness. A considerable proportion of these stimuli occur unconsciously, that is, subliminally. The fact that they are subliminal does not necessarily mean that their status is merely psychological, any more than this would be true of a psychic content. Sometimes they are capable of crossing the threshold, that is, of becoming perceptions. But there is no doubt that a large proportion of these endosomatic stimuli are simply incapable of consciousness and are so elementary that there is no reason to assign them a psychic nature, unless, of course, one favors the philosophical view that all life processes are psychic anyway. The chief objection to this hardly demonstrable hypothesis is that it enlarges the concept of the psyche beyond all bounds and interprets the life process in a way not absolutely warranted by the facts. Concepts that are too broad usually prove to be unsuitable instruments because they are too vague and nebulous. I have therefore suggested that the term psychic be used only where there is evidence of a will capable of modifying reflex of instinctual processes. Here I must refer the reader to my paper on the nature of the psyche. Oh, note to self, I'll have to read that again. I have discussed this definition of the psychic at somewhat greater length. The somatic basis of the ego consists then of conscious and unconscious factors. The same is true of the psychic basis. On the one hand, the ego rests on the total field of consciousness, and on the other of the sum total of unconscious contents. These fall into three groups. First, temporarily subliminal contents that can be reproduced voluntarily, like memory. Second, unconscious contents that cannot be reproduced voluntarily. Or third, contents that are not capable of becoming conscious at all. Group 2 can be inferred from the spontaneous eruption of subliminal contents into consciousness. Group 3 is hypothetical. It is a logical inference from the facts of underlying Group 2. This contains contents which have yet erupted into consciousness, or which never will. When I said that the ego rests on the total field of consciousness, I do not mean that it consists of this. Were that so, it would be indistinguishable from the field of consciousness as a whole. The ego is only the latter's point of reference, grounded on and limited by the somatic factor described above. Although its bases are in themselves relatively unknown and unconscious, the ego is a conscious factor par excellence. It is even acquired, empirically speaking, during the individual's lifetime. It seems to arise in the first place from the collision between the somatic factor and the environment, and once established as a subject, it goes on developing from further collisions with the outer world and the inner. So what he's saying is that once the ego has been created, when you're born on earth and you go through your living experiences at home with your family or wherever you grow up as a child, and you go through those life experiences, it starts to shape your ego. And what happens is your life experiences will continue to shape your ego. It is your response to the outside stimuli. It is everything that's going around. And if you keep the ego going in terms of not seeking something outside of the self, of the material world, and you don't look within yourself so much, then there's less collisions between the outer world of what you experience and the inner world. But the moment that you become aware of the ego and you look deep within yourself, then those collisions, those interconnections, I wouldn't even say they're collisions anymore. It's not like crashing into each other. It's actually a marriage. It's an intertwining of two, where your outer world and your inner world are one in many ways, are intertwined. And you can wake up and see the reflections of your outer world when you look deep within yourself in your inner world. Despite the unlimited extent of its basis, the ego is never more and never less than consciousness as a whole. As a conscious factor, the ego could, theoretically at least, be described completely. So your ego, and this is so true, this is brilliant right here. You can sit down on a piece of paper right now and write down everything that you are. You can go back into your life experience and write down everything that you are. The ego can actually be identified, described completely. But the actual supra-consciousness, the higher self, cannot be described completely. It is all things. It consists of all things. You would have to have a piece of paper that was infinity long. I mean, that's what the higher self is compared to the ego. The ego is just your traits within this lifetime and what you have identified yourself with through your life experiences. And so that's what Melkor's problem is that he can only identify himself with his experience of the outside world, looking at the other Valar and being envy of them. He is not in touch with the higher self and then working with the higher self of Eru Luvatar. Although it doesn't matter, the ego is not in control. The ego only can be in control when you are unconscious of your true self. But the ego is not in control in Tolkien's mythology. It is Eru Luvatar. It is the themes, and it is the way that the music progresses. And that is what we see, is that the fight between good and evil, the darkness and the light, it shows that darkness can never fully destroy the light, and evil can never fully destroy goodness. And there's something really very important for all of us to take from this, that your true self, and I know sometimes people can think this is woo or this is just maybe idealist thinking, but it's truth. The idea that your true self, your higher self, is good. The essence of goodness in terms of wanting harmony, wanting peace, wanting bliss, wanting to experience life without conflict. But it is the ego self that wants the opposite sometimes and doesn't know how to get to the peace because it is simply reacting from the outside world and reacting from its opinions and projections and all that. Despite the unlimited extent of its basis, the ego is never more and never less than consciousness as a whole. As a conscious factor, the ego could theoretically at least be described completely. But this would never amount to more than a picture of the conscious personality. All those features which are unknown or unconscious to the subject would be missing. A total picture would have to include these. But a total description of the personality is, in theory, absolutely impossible, because the unconscious portion of it cannot be grasped cognitively. The unconscious portion, as experience has abundantly shown, is by no means unimportant. On the contrary, the most decisive qualities in a person are often unconscious and can be perceived only by others, or have to be laboriously discovered with outside help. So if you go to my channel and you first come upon my channel, I have this intro and I talk about the unconscious, that I look for the symbols, I look for the messages, I look for things that I can interpret to help others understand the unconscious parts of themselves, the parts of ourselves, of the supraconsciousness that is not yet awakened. It is unconscious. And so it's bringing that forward so it can be conscious of itself. And here is Jung saying that these are the parts that are not unimportant and that they actually can only be found sometimes by someone else being a mirror to us and showing us who we are, who we become, what we're all about. And it also can only be found with outside help, which is what I like to do. So clearly, then, the personality as a total phenomena does not coincide with the ego, that is, with the conscious personality, but forms an entity that has to be distinguished from the ego. Naturally, the need to do this is incumbent only on a psychology that reckons with the fact of the unconscious. But for such a psychology, the distinction is of paramount importance. Even for jurisprudence, it would be of some importance whether certain psychic facts are conscious or not. For instance, in adjudging the question of responsibility, I have suggested calling it a total personality, which, though present, cannot be fully known, the self. The ego is, by definition, subordinate to the self and is related to it like a part to the whole. That's what Tolkien was talking about. Melkor is subordinate to Eru and is related to the whole, although Melkor may experience himself as just a part that wants to dominate over other parts. The ego is by definition subordinate to the self and is related to it like a part to the whole. Inside the field of consciousness, it has, as we say, free will. By this, I do not mean anything philosophical, only the well-known psychological fact of free choice, or rather the subjective feeling of freedom. But just as our free will clashes with necessity in the outside world, so also it finds its limits outside the field of consciousness in the subjective inner world, where it comes into conflict with the facts of the self. And just as circumstances or outside events happen to us and limit our freedom, so the self acts upon the ego like an objective occurrence, which free will can do very little to alter. It is indeed well known that the ego not only can do nothing against the self, but is sometimes actually assimilated by unconscious components of the personality that are in the process of development and is greatly altered by them. It is in the nature of the case impossible to give any general description of the ego except a formal one. Any other mode of observation would have to take account of the individuality which attaches to the ego as one of its main characteristics. Although the numerous elements composing this complex factor are, in themselves, everywhere the same, they are infinitely varied as regards clarity, emotional coloring, and scope. The result of their combination, the ego, is therefore, so far as one can judge, individual and unique, and retains its identity up to a certain point. That is so important, that you can retain your ego up to a certain point, that as soon as the ego gets holes in it, as soon as you meditate or you have some kind of spiritual realization and you maybe meet a teacher that awakens something within you, or you have some kind of moment that opens your mind to something beyond the ego, that's when the ego doesn't retain its identity. It starts to fade away, that your personality is there, but there's an essence of your higher self within your personality. This is the way that the elves have a personality that is egoless in the idea that they have their unique identities, but that they are working towards a collective. They are bound to Arda to see its growth and to see, to see the children of Iluvatar evolve and the next children of Iluvatar to come. There is a identity that attaches itself to the whole. And although you can have a unique identity and the idea that you can have your own life and your own life experiences, there's something else behind all of that that the elves are aware of, that those that awaken to their higher self are aware of, and that they are working towards a greater collective. And the ego no longer has that identity so attached to it, that there's holes through the ego and the light comes through and you see what the ego is all about. Although the numerous elements composing this complex factor are in themselves everywhere the same, they are infinitely varied as regards clarity, emotional coloring, and scope. The result of their combination, the ego, is therefore, so far as one can judge, individual and unique and retains its identity up to a certain point. Its stability is relative because far-reaching changes of personality can sometimes occur. Far-reaching, reaching out for the higher self. It's going to cause a disruption in the ego. The ego is not going to think of itself as, I am this born into this life and this is who I am and this is my career and I am this person. That you will start to realize that you're playing a role for that temporary time. You had that experience for temporary time. There's something else having a life experience. It is the ultimate observer beyond the ego self. Since it is a point of reference for the field of consciousness, I'm sorry, let me keep going here. Its stability, is relative because far-reaching changes of personality can sometimes occur. Alterations of this kind need not always be pathological. They can also be developmental and hence fall within the scope of the normal, since it is the point of reference for the field of consciousness. The ego is the subject of all successful attempts at adaptation so far as these are achieved by the will. The ego, therefore, has a significant part to play in the psychic economy. Its position there is so important that there are good grounds for the prejudice that the ego is the sentry of the personality, and that the field of consciousness is the psyche per se. If we discount certain suggestive ideas in Leibniz, Kant, Schelling, and Schopenhauer, and the philosophical excoriations of Gams and von Hartmann, it is only since the end of the 19th century that modern psychology with its inductive methods have discovered the foundations of consciousness and proved empirically the existence of a psyche outside consciousness. With this discovery, the position of the ego, till then absolute, becomes relatalized. That is to say, though it retains its quality as a sentry of the field of consciousness, it is questionable whether it is the sentry of the personality. It is the part of the personality, but not the whole of it. As I have said, it is simply impossible to estimate how large or how small its share is. How free or how dependent it is on the qualities of this extra conscious psyche. We can only say that its freedom is limited, and its dependence proved in ways that are often decisive. Have you ever had a conversation with somebody that you know has a big ego, in the idea, not that they're necessarily arrogant, but that they are in their own type of perspectives, and then when you have a conversation with them and somehow you poke through that ego, it's like you could see a change in their face, you could see a change in their body, and you can even sense the change energetically, that they have relaxed, that they are not so stubborn within their self-identity, but they have embraced something about compromising with you, and a peace can be had now between you two, between two souls. But if the ego is so concrete between each other, that's when the fights and the arguments play out, and there is no compromise. So one soul within that argument has to soften the ego and let the light of the true self poke through, that wants collective understanding, harmony, unison, and a blissful experience, really. Just a happy experience, not fighting all the time. That's not fun. Maybe for some people, but I doubt that there is beings that want to just fight forever and ever and ever for all eternity. That could get very tiresome. Just as peace for all eternity might also get tiresome. So therefore the conflict is born. To have a little drama, to have a little fun, and a challenge for the consciousness. As I have said, it is simply impossible to estimate how large or how small its share is. How free or how dependent it is on the qualities of this extra conscious psyche. We can only say that its freedom is limited and its dependence proved in ways that are often decisive. He's talking about the ego. In my experience, one would do well not to underestimate its dependence on the unconscious. Naturally, there is no need to say this to persons who already overestimate the latter's importance. Some criterion for the right measure is afforded by the psychic consequences of a wrong estimate, a point to which we shall return later on. We have seen that from the standpoint of the psychology of consciousness, the unconscious can be divided into three groups of contents. But from the standpoint of the psychology of the personality, a twofold division ensues. An extra conscious psyche, whose contents are personal, and an extra conscious psyche, whose contents are impersonal and collective. The first group comprises contents which are integral components of the individual personality and could therefore just as well be conscious. The second group forms, as it were, an omnipresent, unchanging, everywhere identical quality or substrate of the psyche per se, divided into three groups. What he is saying is that three groups can symbolize three different types of people. You have one person where it is completely ego dominated. It is from their only subjective experience. And so they don't work towards the collective. They are completely going by their ego. Those are the murderers in our world. Those are the serial killers. Those are the terrorists. Those are those that are completely in their subjective experience. And they react to the world that way. Then you have the middle group, which is both. I would say I'm in the middle, maybe towards the other third group, which I'll get into. But the middle group are those that have the ego in place, have their identity, but they're also aware of a collective, understanding that they're working towards a collective, they're trying to better society in some way, that their job, their career, whatever their life path is to help others as well as themselves have a life, have, a home. And so it's a mix of the ego and the collective. And then the third soul group is all collective consciousness. Those are your Buddhas. Those are your sages. Those are the ones that live very much aligned completely to the collective and really have a hard time focusing on just the self. So is it better to be in that state where you're completely all in the collective? I would say that it's about different life experiences. If you're ready to take on that role in this earth, if you're ready to have that experience, then you will forget a lot of your ego needs and you'll forget about your individualistic kind of personality and needs, and you'll be just kind of one with everything. And from there, you can help others. And from there, you can be a teacher, and Jesus was there, and Buddha, and all of those great masters. That is the collective consciousness. That is that third category. But the middle one is where the majority of people are, where it's a mix of your collective consciousness and your ego consciousness. And you do this elegant dance, and sometimes you do a fight and a struggle. But there is that other group of those that have not awakened who represent completely the ego self. So I'll keep going. We have seen that from the standpoint of the psychology of consciousness, the unconscious can be divided into three groups of contents. But from the standpoint of the psychology of the personality, a twofold division ensues: an extra-conscious psyche whose contents are personal, and an extra-consciousness psyche, or an extra-conscious psyche whose contents are impersonal and collective. The impersonal collective, that is the third category. The third type of person that lives completely for the collective and has no personal needs or wants, kind of. An extra-conscious psyche whose contents are personal, and an extra-conscious psyche whose contents are impersonal and collective. The first group comprises contents which are integral components of the individual personality and could therefore just as well be conscious. The second group forms, as it were, an omnipresent, unchanging, and everywhere identical quality or substrate of the psyche per se. This is, of course, no more than a hypothesis, but we are driven to it by the peculiar nature of the empirical material, not to mention the high probability that the general similarity of psychic processes in all individuals must be based on an equally general and impersonal principle that conforms to law, just as the instinct manifesting itself in the individual is only the partial manifestation of an instinctual substrate common to all men. And that is the end of that essay. So when we look and break down the actual words of Tolkien within the creation mythology, you see the idea of consciousness, you see ego and how it takes place, and then you can apply that wisdom into your own life. I know that when I had a remembrance and a reawakening through the words of J.R.R Tolkien's Silmarillion, learning about Melkor and understanding, well, that's where Sauron came from, is that energy, that same energy. And when I started to learn about that, I really took a look at myself and saw, what was I doing to play the Melkor, in other people's lives or my own, and this is where we become aware and we can start to change things for the better, the far-reaching personality, which is what Carl Jung suggested, that you can then gain a personality that is a self-identity that is connected to the collective and is aware of the ego and all of that, and can manifest itself in its identity, the way that you behave, the way that you act and, go through your life. It will become part of your personality, is this collective understanding and far-reaching personality. And so that is kind of the goal, I would say, of the Elven spiritual path, is we want humans to awaken to their far-reaching personality and be individuals, but also be very much aware of the higher self and the collective, and that what we're all kind of working towards. I'm going to end with a Tesla's quote that I just want you to think about in terms of the science that is involved in the mythology of Tolkien's creation myth, is this: if you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequencies, and vibration. The natural frequency of an object is associated with one of its many standing wave patterns by which it vibrates with. The natural frequencies of a musical instrument are sometimes referred to as the harmonics of the instrument. An instrument can be forced into vibrating at one of its harmonics with one of its standing wave patterns if another interconnected object pushes it with one of those frequencies. This is resonance. When a second object vibrating at the same natural frequency as the first object forces it into vibrational motion. So when we say we resonate with something, when the elves resonate with us, do you know what that means? According to Nikola Tesla, or I think he say, what is it, Nikolai Tesla? I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but Tesla in general, when we think about that idea, the idea of saying the elves resonate with me, the archetype that Tolkien created of the elves within those stories has pushed against your own vibrations, frequencies within yourself, and has created an interconnected reality that has created a new vibration and resonance in the idea of making you awaken to your connection to the elves. And that's just an example, but we can resonate with many things. It is when something affects another and creates the vibrational patterns. So think about that in terms of Tolkien's mythology, and you can see that Tolkien had a great grasp of what Tesla did and the idea of understanding how the universe itself came into manifestation through the frequencies and through the vibrations that we see. And when we tap into certain vibrations and frequencies, it determines our types of reality that we live in. So I thought that that was a really interesting part in the idea of resonance and how that, if I go back to it, the idea that when a second object vibrating at the same natural frequency, so here's a really big message for all of you. The elves of Tolkien already are at a natural frequency within us all, in the idea that they exist at a natural state of vibration, of origins within humans, in terms of being wiser beings. It is about having them affect you in some way, inspire you when you read the story. And it's a second object. The elves are the second object that is vibrating at the same natural frequency as you already, as the first object, and then forces it into vibrational motion. This is the activation, the DNA activation. This is what we're talking about in the New Age of activating your DNA, activating yourself, moving into the next phase and the next stage of your existence, being inspired by the elves or inspired by whatever inspires you. It acts upon your vibrations. But one key thing to note is that it already exists at your natural frequency. It is not that you are trying to obtain something that's not within you already. It is already within you. The way that the elves behave, the way that the elves act, the way that we love the elves, it's already within you. It is about rising to that frequency yourself and living in that reality. And that, I think, is something really amazing that Tesla had to teach. There are so many just really interesting things that Tesla did for the world, but especially in the idea of terms of how our reality is created. So just remember that and take that to heart, that the elves are already at a natural frequency within you. It's about reawakening to it and remembering it and moving forward from that place after it inspires you and that resonance is created. So those that have felt, I resonate with the elves, and I've used that a lot, what that really means is that the elves have already been at your natural state of frequency, and you were just remembering it and awakening to it once again. So I hope you enjoyed this, and we went really deep into the Silmarillion, and hopefully that answered a lot of your questions in the way that, what does the void mean and what does Melkor symbolize? And you have your own ideas and opinions, so you absolutely can leave them. I think that this would be a great way of us just to have a really deep discussion with one another. But I'm going to read your comments later, and I'm so happy that many of you joined me. This was definitely a long one today. So thank you so much for hanging in there. And I will see you all on the next video.